you are here today. To proceed, there's no doubt that there is existence. There is no doubt that there is existence. Existence is divided into two things: possible existence and necessary existence. Possible existence is existence that otherwise doesn't need to exist. And it's existence that could be arranged in any other way. It's existence which is dependent. For example, I'm wearing a blue blazer. This is a possible existence. It doesn't have to exist. It could be arranged in another way. And it's dependent upon materials that were created, used to create it. Necessary existence, on the other hand, is existence which couldn't be any other way. Existence which could not be any other way, is independent, self-sufficient, and could not be out of existence. Now, the main argument today is this: there cannot be a world with only possible existences. That is the main argument. There cannot be a world with only possible existences. Why? Because if there was only possible existences, I'm going to be using the board a little bit. If there's only possible existences, you would have dependent things depending upon other dependent things. Now, this can be reasoned metaphysically, ontologically, and cosmologically. For example, we have a mathematical set. This is like a series, yes? And you have things within that. Dependent 1, dependent 2, dependent 3. If this series existed by itself, it would require something outside of it, an independent thing, in order for that series to exist. Now, what if we say if this is an infinite series? It's not really a good sign, but let's say if it was an infinite series. We'll get to that in what follows. Now, let's use a cosmological example. We have a tree. There's very beautiful trees here, by the way, in California. Like a cherry tree. I saw a cherry tree. Very beautiful. That tree requires the sun to photosynthesize in order to exist. I think it's fair to say if the tree didn't exist, or if the sun didn't exist, the tree would not exist. It's fair to say this, yes? So long as the sun is required, or so long as the tree exists, the sun will exist. Even if that was for an infinite amount of time. Now, the sun itself is part of its own order. And it's part of its own set. Now, it requires other things in order to exist. At the end of this, what is required, once again, is an independent thing. This independent thing can only be one. Wait a minute. Why is that? Because if there was more than one necessary existence, it wouldn't be a necessary existence, because it could be conceived that it can be arranged in another way. And you can't have two things which are independent, because which one is dependent on which? Therefore, whether you conceptualize this ontologically, cosmologically, on materialism, dualism, idealism, you must conclude that what is required in order for any existence to exist is an independent thing. That is one. That is always in existence. Why? Because if it wasn't in existence, if it could be conceived that this thing is not in existence, it wouldn't be necessary. So it has to be eternal. And it cannot be made up of parts. Why? Because anything which is a compound is generated. Anything that's made up of parts is dependent on those parts. That's point number one. And point number two, if it was a possible existence, if it's made up of parts, you can imagine those parts being arranged in a different way. Therefore, it falls into the category of possible existence. To summarize, you require an independent thing outside of the series of dependent things in order for any existence to exist. This thing must be one. It cannot have parts. It must be immaterial, incorporeal. What else must it be? It must be eternal. Now, the definition of a cause is something which brings rise to phenomena. I can cause a house to be. For example, I can build a house, yes? I can build a house. But I can die and the house will continue to be, yes? So I don't need to exist in order for the house to continue existing. Dependence, on the other hand, is when you rely on something else. So he made the mistake of saying that contingency, which is dependence, relies upon cause and effect. It doesn't, which is why I didn't really mention cause and effect to avoid this discussion altogether. Let us agree for the sake of arguments, okay? Let's agree that there's no such thing as cause and effect. The contingency argument, the way I framed it, is still valid because I didn't mention cause and effect at all. Let me tell you why. Bertrand Russell, interesting atheist, when he was commenting on the cosmological argument, Ghazali's argument that William Lane Craig and those other guys are making popular now in this country, it's Ghazali's argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Okay. So Bertrand Russell said, but this is the problem of composition. Because you're saying that just because there are causes in the universe, it doesn't mean that that cause will be applied to the universe. So he says, for example, just because we have mothers as part of the human race, it doesn't mean that the human race itself has mother. Imagine a wall. Like Trump likes walls. Yeah, you have a wall. Just because, this is Bertrand Russell, it's a very valid argument. He says just because a wall is made up of small parts, it doesn't mean that the wall itself is small. He's right. Bertrand Russell was right. However, what if the wall is made up of red parts? The wall itself can be red. So the fallacy of composition is a double-edged sword. Because in order for it to be a proper fallacy, it needs to have perfect knowledge of the whole. If you don't have perfect knowledge of the whole, you can't claim it to be a fallacy. So both the theist and the atheist are in a gridlock. Because the atheist is saying, well, it can't be the small part, it can't be the big. But the theist is saying, well, the red part can make, red bricks can make a red wall. And both can be possible, but both can be argued against. You see? So this is why I use the contingency argument. Let me bring back the argument that I used. Causation. For the sake of argument, no problem. You can have causation. Let's pretend, there's no causation. Let's pretend. No problem. Let's pretend. It's possible that it can exist and it's possible that it can't outside the universe on a logical basis. However, contingency, dependence, I made an ontological argument, a mathematical argument. You have a set. Things within the set are all dependent. Yes? Now you can't have the existence of things if everything is dependent on everything else. If existence depends upon dependent things, existence would never exist. You have two options. Either there's an independent outside, or this thing itself is the independent. This series is the independent. And what is it? The independent, the necessary independent. However, is it conceivable to think of this series, if we take out D2, as different? Yes. And we said a possible existence is something which can be rearranged. Wait a minute now, this is a serious argument. I'm not going to be William Lane Craig here today. I know you're used to this. I use his debates with William Lane Craig. This is his argument. I know the weaknesses of the argument. I didn't use this argument. I want the most undercutting argument. No one can crack this argument. I've read from Plato to Leibniz all the way through to Russell. And believe me, this is the argument no one can solve. This is the uncrackable code. So he tried to crack the code by saying, well, the necessary existence should have the entailment of the dependent things. Well, I'm saying the complete opposite. I'm saying that it's impossible for it to be made up of parts and still be the necessary existence. Because a possible existence is an existence that is subject to change. So, to use this phraseology, if we look at the weight of the evidence, the totality of the evidence, where extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, we have an extraordinary evidence. We have an absolutely extraordinary evidence, which works in the mind mathematically. and works in physical reality, cosmologically, and works on first principles. And we get the independent, self-sufficient, one entity, which we as Muslims call Allah. That's it. What if there's a multiverse? What if there's a multiverse? No problem. Have an infinite amount of universes. Or not even just universes, because why discriminate towards universes? Creations. You need something to depend upon those things. And we said it can't be that because you can envisage taking a universe in and out. And so it's dependent upon the structure. It's over. You see here, it's important to be honest with ourselves. He's a lawyer. A lot of lawyers are referred to as liars, but he's not one of them. He's a good man. And as a lawyer, when he goes into the courtroom, he refers to witness testimony. He makes abductive arguments, like CSI forensics, put the evidences together. It's not God of the gaps. Just in the same way as if you put food for a dog, and then you go away, and the food is eaten, you're not going to say that's a dog of the gaps argument. It's just an abductive inference, which he does every time. And if it's not that, if you don't do an abductive inference, then all of the cases he's represented have been miscarriages of justice, which I'm sure he wouldn't do. And the point here is this. The point is, when we put the totality of evidence, asking for more evidence, you know what it's like? When we've given you ontological, metaphysical, a priori, a posteriori, scientific, physical, mathematic, probabilistic evidences. It's like asking for a torch when you're in the middle of daylight.